Welcome everyone to our conversation with Palestinian sociologist Mohamed Bamie and Israeli political scientist Uri Gordon, who's joining us from the UK. Thank you, Jason and Sunset Labs, for hosting this event. Also, shout out to Camus Books, University of Victoria's Anarchist Archive, and Envy for helping put this event together. We acknowledge we are holding this event a stone's throw from a clam-bearing inlet within the home territories of the Lekwungen peoples, represented by the Songhees and Esquimalt nations. These territories once featured old-growth forests and meadows where indigenous peoples cultivated the flowering camas plant, whose bulbs are a key food source. Colonization, fueled by white supremacy, capitalism, and state power, has been dedicated to dispossessing the Songhees and Esquimalt nations from their lands and culture. In the face of this, we are in solidarity with the resistance, resiliency, and cultural revitalization of the Songhees and Esquimalt nations, and we rededicate ourselves to interrupting structures of colonial violence and fostering decolonization at home and abroad. We will now review our code of conduct before introducing our speakers. My name's Soraya, and this is Joel. We'll be the moderators for today. Take it away, Joel.
We will not dehumanize or marginalize anyone due to their religion, ethnicity, or nationality. We will not tolerate racism in any form. We will be respectful at all times. We will not shout at, curse at, insult, or belittle each other. We agree that opinions can and should be questioned, but without attacking the person voicing them. We will not threaten or use any form of violence against each other. By attending this event, we agree to abide by this code of conduct. We agree that violating this code may result in our being politely escorted out of this event.
Professor Mohamed Bamie from the Department of Sociology at the University of Pittsburgh is the author of Anarchy as Order, The History and Future of Civil Humanity. Dr. Uri Gordon, author of Anarchy Alive, Anti-Authoritarian Politics from Practice to Theory, is an independent scholar now based in the UK. Thank you, Uri and Mohammed. Currently, we have a single state in Palestine, the state of Israel, which oppresses and displaces Palestinians. Were a Palestinian state established, do you think it would solve this problem?
Okay, thank you. This is, I have actually, although, as Yuri said, we probably should prioritize kind of the genocide and the moral outrage and so on at this point. But also, I think we do also have to understand the complexity of the situation as such. And when it comes to the solutions that have been proposed to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I think there are, one require moral complexity, actually, in a way, right? So there are several solutions, of course, that have been proposed in the past. Now, I think, and I've said that before, that the two-state solution, right, impractical as it may be, right, would be preferable to the status quo, to the occupation. It is not ideal, of course, and may not even be practical at this point, but it is better than the occupation. Better yet is the one-state solution, which actually adjusts to the reality that we already have. But also that too seems to be impractical at this point. Then we have the no-state solution, which in my view is better than the previous two solutions. Right? So in a way, we have orders of preferences actually in this kind of, it's not as though I want a no-state solution and I am not going to accept any other solution until I get that. I don't think that's actually a practical way of going about solving problems, especially when we have a genocide kind of confronting us. The orders of priorities. So in a way, a two-state solution would solve some problem, of course. But of course, it would continue to be, depending on how you do the two states, might continue to be a colonial situation in under a guise of some other kind of a structure, so to speak. And that is, the two-state solution happens to be the solution that has some kind of a diplomatic international consensus on it. That does not mean that's going to happen. ultimately. That basically what we have basically is a settlement policy. That means that you do one of two things. Either you expel populations on both sides in large numbers, or you have two states, each of which have to accept that a substantial number of their citizens are from the other community with equal rights, so to speak. If that happens, that would be a vast improvement on what we have right now. That is not though what is on the table. Of course, as we know, even this solution that has never been accepted by any Israeli government, not just Netanyahu, but there has never been actually any Israeli government in the past that actually accepted the two-state solution formally. Not even during the Oslo Accords. Even then, that was not actually acknowledged as a possibility of the solution. The one-state solution, of course, I think we'll talk about that. Is there a question about that, or that was it? Because I can address that later. If there isn't, I can talk about that right now, which is that indeed we have right now a reality of one-state solution. Other people have said that we have one state. It's not a solution, but we have a one state, and it is an apartheid state ultimately. Right? So the question here, of course, we don't actually in Israel we do not have a democratic state at this point, right? We have basically an apartheid situation with half of the population that lives in that territory lives without any rights at all, right, so to speak. So there is a liberal democratic kind of a principle that can be invoked here in favor of that one-state solution. Of course, it hits another obstacle, namely that it kind of goes against the fundamental kind of Zionist image of building a Jewish homeland. Basically, that excludes other people as well. And that is what makes that unrealistic. So when we talk about no-state solution, I don't think we are actually talking about something that is a fancy idea, so to speak. And we're not talking about something that is unrealistic, because the solutions that are being proposed and being argued on their behalf as being the realistic solution are in fact not realistic at this point. Right? So we have to look beyond the existing reality.
Again, not much to add here. One sort of halfway house, again, not more or less practical than any of these other diplomatic solutions, is the idea of a confederation, some kind of two-state confederation where citizens of each state can live in the territory of the other state and vote for parliament in their citizenship state and vote for municipal in the other state, and that will enable, absorption of refugees in 48 Israel and for settlers to remain. You can talk about a three-state confederation with Jordan. You can talk about turning Jerusalem into an international area and moving the UN headquarters to Jerusalem. I mean, all of these are plausible diplomatic solutions, but right now there is not the political will to implement them, and not the pressure on Israel from the superpowers to concede to a situation which would mean redressing the imbalance and inequality and asymmetry on the ground. And so I agree with Mohammed that the no-state solution is no less plausible than the other two, just because all of them seem so far away at the moment. But to me, I think the no-state solution as a horizon is the only one that includes the decolonization of social relations on the ground, because even one state, okay, it would still be a capitalist state, and we would still be imagining it along some kind of binational class society. I mean, it's kind of impossible to imagine anything very positive right now. So yeah, and that just takes me back to the kind of immediate need to just stop what's going on and enable things to at least reach a a level of tolerability for the Gazans at this point.
Thank you. Another question for both of you. What would collective liberation for Palestinians and Jews look like?
What is collective liberation? Remove all the borders, destroy all the weapons, erase all the money, classless society, no patriarchy, all the rest of that good stuff. I mean, the solution to the Israeli-Palestinian question ultimately is the same solution to the social question. But that's our utopian horizon, right? That's at this point, this is something that is informing us, informing the way we organize in anti-national and anti-fascist fronts. It informs our attempt to have horizontal structures in what we do, I don't like the word, but to prefigure or to have a concrete utopia as much as we can in whatever we do currently in terms of our efforts. So, collective liberation ultimately, like, it looks different everywhere and it looks the same everywhere in this sense. And yeah, it's just something that, I think we feel at the moment that we are so far away from, that the most we can hope for is like gleanings of that vision in our everyday efforts, even if they're on a very kind of human rights or even humanitarian level.
Okay, I agree with Uri about this. I just would like to add that one form of emancipation that I imagine and I consider to be ideal is when we emancipate ourselves actually from kind of this commitment to a national identity that becomes our primary kind of defining point. There is a reason for that, of course, because we have a situation of conflict and where rights are denied on the basis of nationality. So that actually redoubles people's commitment to their nationhood. Also, rights being granted on the basis of nationality exclusively, that also redoubles some people's kind of commitment to it. So ultimately, ideally, a solution would be to actually make it possible for people to distance themselves from this commitment to nationalism, and that means solving the problem that causes this attachment to nationalism. Right? Now, we have historical parallels for this, and I think actually Israel-Palestine is actually not a unique case, even though it is unique in some respects. But actually, when you look at the larger region of the Middle East, ultimately, the one time that region actually functioned well historically, when we had open borders, when you had minimal borders, when you had the free movement of populations, right? And where you had Jewish communities as part of the natural fabric of the region, not in Palestine, but in Iraq, in Egypt, in Yemen, in North Africa, everywhere, right? You had Jewish communities that were doing relatively well, ultimately, right? So the idea of actually thinking in a way that
You didn't say when, that this was during, you didn't say what time you were referring to.
What I'm talking about the pre-1948 particular. And the related to that, of course, is that the demographic reality is the fact that pretty much all states we have the region are colonial creations. And they all actually, I think, in the long run, have proved themselves to be failures in the sense that the only way they can live in the region is by generating conflicts with each other, to speak right, and vying for hegemony for no reason other than this is the logic of the state, basically in the region, and the logic of states that don't have actually legitimacy, but their legitimacy resides entirely in having an enemy, so to speak, that allows each state to actually mobilize its population and create an identity against that external enemy. Right? And this is emancipation, to get ourselves away basically from that straitjacket that basically colonial processes have implanted in the region in Palestine, of course, but all around Palestine as well.
Thank you. Mohammed, you have argued that throughout history, people have constructed anarchic systems of mutual obligation, solidarity, and trust that are integral to our collective well-being. Do you see paths towards mobilizing these values so as to end ethnic conflict in Palestine?
I do, but in a different way than you present. In a sense, let me talk about the Palestinian case in particular. Ultimately, one important thing about the Palestinian kind of historical experience is that Palestinian society continued to exist after a colonial experience, continued to exist in the diaspora as well. Right? So after 1948, in the refugee camps, but also elsewhere in the diaspora, Palestinian society reconstituted itself by the force of these traditions, ultimately, that it already have. So, for example, if you look at the refugee camps, right, basically in Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, elsewhere, and how they survived for, say, between 1948 until the late 60s and beyond. One thing that helped a great deal, right, is the survival of Palestinian village culture of mutual aid and support and generosity and what have you, meaning that basically property rights, for example, in the camps were recognized informally without any documents, without any papers, without any government telling people who owns what. And there's, of course, I think Nadia Haj did a lot of research, and other people have actually done a lot of research to document that point, is how a traditional culture, so to speak, right, and traditional links actually allowed the society to continue to exist under extreme condition without a government, right, and without any enforcing mechanism, basically, of that system of mutual aid. Now, I am not arguing that those were the only kind of traditions that help people survive, to the extent that these traditions are voluntary, mutually recognized by everyone, because by the late 70s, there's another culture that enters the refugee camps, and that is revolutionary culture. So you have modern revolutionary organizations that work across the refugee camps that actually have new principles, meaning, for example, that someone who is not from a notable family can become a leader. There's more meritocratic kind of elements basically in that revolutionary culture. And that revolutionary culture lives or lived side by side with this traditional village culture. So I think in a way, I'm not talking about these cultures resolving ethnic conflict. That is, I think, asking too much of those traditions. That's not what they do. What they do is actually try to keep society in a state of existence and solidarity under horrific conditions. Gaza, likewise. Gaza, in fact, right, because of the hardships, not right now, but before October 7th, and for many decades afterwards, the family institution became a lot stronger than it used to be before, precisely because it was really crucial for the survival of the population. So you have actually part, and I'm talking about the extended family, not the nuclear family, right? That became actually a lot more important than it used to be. It was always there, but there are kind of conditions of hardship that actually caused that kind of culture to become reinforced and people to be a lot more committed to it. Right? So when I talk about these traditions, actually, that is really what that's the value that I see in them, even though sometimes they do actually foster a conservative mindset. But conservatism does not come out of nowhere, right? It becomes more solidly established when people see something in it that helps them actually continue to live together.
Yuri, you have been involved in solidarity actions to defend Palestinian lands from Israeli incursions. The refusal to serve in the Israeli army is one such action. Can you discuss other kinds of activism and how they disrupt state domination?
I wish there was a lot to discuss in the Israeli-Palestinian context. I know that since October and the start of the war, the Refusnik Support Organization New Profile has received hundreds of phone calls from young people seeking advice about refusing, evading. I mean, we support what's called gray refusal, evasion as much as public refusal. There have been beginnings of demonstrations against the war by Israeli Jews. Demonstrations of Palestinian citizens of Israel have been much more harshly repressed and prevented. Yesterday, there were a few dozens of demonstrators in central Tel Aviv. There were 5 arrests, and this was an explicitly kind of a demo against the genocide, against the war, unlike previous ones that were kind of more under the guise of return the hostages or maximum kind of trying to rekindle the civic uprising against the Netanyahu government. There are some accompaniment and monitoring efforts that are going on where volunteers are present at Palestinian villages, especially in the West Bank, South Hebron Hills, Jordan Valley, that are recently suffering from a lot of settler violence, incursions, and so on. But I'm very sad to say that even what we could say existed of an Israeli radical left perhaps 20 years ago has become much weaker. A lot of people have left the country, and right now I can't really point to a lot of very sort of inspiring stuff. I mean, there are still, of course, Israeli-Palestinian joint struggle networks going on, but we really are at the low point in this respect.
Thank you, Uri. When we think of and talk about a no-state solution, for us, the most compelling model that comes to mind is the Syrian Democratic Council and the Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria, also known as Rojava. This is a multi-ethnic, multi-party federation of decentralized, self-governing districts that asserts its autonomy on the local level in a manner that spreads organically. Can you comment on this example?
Okay, I think it is a great example. I've been hearing, of course, a lot about it over the years. It's an experiment. I think that's the way actually we should look at Rojava. It is an ongoing experiment. That means, like all experiments, that there are going to be mistakes. People are going to hopefully to learn from them. And there are 2 things I'd like to say about Rojava. One has to do with the perception of the outside world of what Rojava is. And second, how Rojava resonates with other movements of what we call the Arab Spring, ultimately. Now, in terms of Rojava as a great example, basically, there are representations of Rojava as a Kurdish experiment. And I found that problematic. Actually, for example, you have German filmmakers who go there and portray that how the Kurds are great, the Arabs are bad, and so on. And there's a certain amount of racism, basically, in that kind of portrayal that I found really objectionable, ultimately, and goes against the spirit of what Rojava is. But there is basically that kind of uninformed, I think, attempt to take what is a quasi-anarchist experiment and put an ethnic kind of a stamp on it, even though it is not really intended that way. But it does not come out of nowhere. It comes out of social traditions plus some organizational capacity that is there, and it is there. The other thing about Rojava, right, is that if you look at the Arab Spring movements from 2011 and afterwards, 2019 as well, the second wave of the Arab Spring, what you see is what I have called an anarchist method of rebellion that seem to actually be ingrained in the existing social traditions, to speak up, because these are not organized movements. They do not generate a political party that leads them. They seem to be uninterested in leadership. They seem to be relying on mutual help and aid and spontaneity as an art of movement, all these things. Right? Now, of course, these movements were criticized but because of these kind of properties, because kind of commentators who wanted to see result or outcome wanted to say, well, they have all failed because of their lack of organization, because of their anarchism, etc. But one thing that is actually interesting to me sociologically is that the ordinary people who did those revolts were actually not interested in organizations or leadership or what have you, and they seem to be expressing something deeper, namely an interest of not being governed, ultimately. When you are in the revolution, in the heat of it, that is precisely the point when you are not being governed. And you enjoy that experience, ultimately, and you want it to be the condition of society to come after the revolution. Now, of course, it is not as though kind of people who did, the ordinary people who did the Arab uprisings actually have read books about anarchism, right? Or even used the term to describe what they wanted. But this is kind of a more of an ingrained, organic anarchism that was always part of the social traditions along with contrary traditions in the same mind of the same person, right? So on the one hand, there are things I do in my village that are voluntary, right, and solidaristic and enjoyable. Right? On the other hand, I think it would be nice if we have an enlightened despotism in charge, in the same mind, the same person. So, and when you compare the Arab Spring to previous kind of revolutionary movement, you see that they were not that way. So there's a learning process that is happening across the region that has an intuitive character to it, in the sense that it is not organized, it is not actually identified as such by the people who do it, nor recognized by the intellectuals, essentially, who write about the revolutions or are interested in revolution, but there's a historical memory, basically how previous attempts at liberation have been conducted. We had charismatic leaderships in the past. We don't have them right now. Why? Because we have tried that already, right? And charisma has not helped us. So it is now to try another trick that comes out of the same mind, right? To speak out, speak. So what is happening on Rojava, I think, is not happening in a vacuum. And it's not happening only in one region. It seems to me to be an expression of a broader kind of sentiment that you see in the whole region, in the direction of thinking about a post-despotic, post-tyrannical kind of system that includes somehow not being governed. And again, this is not self-conscious anarchism, but it is an organic anarchism that had been mixed with other ways of thinking in the same mind until now. And I hope, and one thing that Rojava is doing is perhaps clarifying kind of the distinction between these different ways of thinking about social and political order.
Uri, do you have any thoughts?
I have not been to Rojava and I don't know a lot about it. I mean, I think Mohammed's analysis right there was very insightful, and I might add one thing, which is, to me, there's not just Rojava, but also the example of the Zapatista communities in Chiapas, which have recently had a kind of further decentralization to their structure. And if you look at freedomnews.org.uk, the Freedom, the oldest English language anarchist paper that I'm part of the collective of, we did a few features on that. And I think that inevitably all of the modern examples of quasi-anarchist social organization that we have seen have been at some kind of geopolitical juncture that has made them succeed or be able to succeed or not. And I mean, if we look at Rojava, I mean, people don't like this to be mentioned, but there is a cooperation between Rojava, at least the armed forces there, and the American military, working together against armed jihadist groups. And the situation in Rojava, they've just found themselves, in a juncture where they're basically more helpful to world powers than not. Similarly, the Zapatistas in Chiapas kind of had the fortune or misfortune of being in one of the economically and geopolitically marginal parts of Latin America, where there was enough of conditions to allow them to be more or less left alone, except when they weren't. And now with the sort of strengthening of cartel activity across the Mexican-Guatemala border, we're seeing a lot more threats to them there. So, this is always a combination of the factors that Mohammed mentioned with a kind of external international geopolitical factors. Whether anything immediate can be learned from that for the situation Israel-Palestine, we're so far away from that. Like I said in the beginning, right now we just have to halt the war crimes. We have to create a situation where some kind of framework, some kind of envelope can be found in order to start somehow rebuilding towards some kind of humane situation on the ground. The rest, that's our utopian horizon.
Thank you. A foundational value that Movement for a Democratic Society promotes is ecological renewal, because when communities recognize this is in their common interest, it reinforces cooperation and solidarity. Could such ecological activism serve as one avenue toward replacing state structures in Palestine?
I think that is without saying. Of course, that is part of the. There are some also Israelis and Palestinians also working have that kind of ecological consciousness. And they think of it, of course, as part of the situation. This war is leading to an enormous amount of environmental degradation. In terms of there's one study I just saw recently about greenhouse emissions that have resulted just from this war, including, of course, the explosives as well as the military transportation that is kind of associated with it. And I forgot what the number is, but there's a huge kind of increase in CO2 emissions since October 7th until today, right? So this war is not doing any good to the environment. No, of course, I don't think this is. I think that's obvious. Also, the way water resources are used, basically, that has always been really a crucial part of in an area where kind of water shortage is acute, basically, and the fact that the settlers have a lot more rights to water than the indigenous population. When Gaza was under Israeli occupation, for example, there were 7,000 Jewish settlers in Gaza and 1.5 million Palestinians back then. The 7,000 settlers used or had right to as much water as the 1.5 million Palestinians. So if you look at the West Bank, the situation is not that much better. So in terms, and of course that affects not just the Palestinians, but also where water goes elsewhere in the region, because that is all connected to each other. So we are facing an area that is suffering from kind of a global warming, that already had water shortage before the current climate crisis, and the problem is going to get worse. And the only way it can be resolved is by regional cooperation. It can't be resolved any other way. The conflict is going to actually to lead more wars over the same scarce resource. And I don't see the environment actually benefiting at all from this. In fact, the conflict is actually contributing, right, to the global climate crisis that we have right now.
Yeah, I mean, to say that, both pollution and solutions don't know borders. And certainly, the effects on the water table and the whole kind of situation with effluents and everything else is connected immediately to the water management practices and to the unequal power and equal allocation of water resources in the region. There was a time when, during the Oslo years, it was thought that environmental cooperation could be a route. What often took place was that these projects have taken and still take place within very asymmetric power relations, and without the Palestinian side getting the kind of resources or power that would enable it to be an equal partner in these situations. But I mean, I think one thing that connects to what Muhammad was speaking about before is the idea that, thinking ecologically, thinking in terms of watersheds, in terms of biomes, in terms of climate regions, is one way to wean ourselves off nationalist thinking, and that it's potentially possible through that type of angle to achieve a different outlook that is no longer wedded to those things. But for that to happen, there first has to be political equality. There has to be human dignity acknowledged equally for Palestinians as for Israelis. And so, we can talk about these things as very positive sort of potentials. But like diplomatic solutions, like everything else, none of this is going to go anywhere until there is a massive international pressure and a much stronger international movement of boycott, divestment, and sanctions that will force the hand of the Israeli government.
Thank you, Mohammed and Uri. Last question. Given the increasing influence of ultra-Orthodox Judaism and fundamentalist Islam, for lack of a better term, how do you envision building a secular society in Palestine?
Okay, well, that's easy. Here's my answer, though. This is something I work on actually a lot, modern religiosity. And my perspective on it is that what we call fundamentalism is not the problem. It is a symptom of a problem. So if you think, for example, about Hamas in particular as an organization, just take one example. In 1948, there was no Hamas. In 1967, there was no Hamas either. There was, in fact, a Palestinian resistance movement that was entirely secular. And resistance movements throughout the region as well against other governments were entirely secular. What we call fundamentalism is a later outgrowth, which means that we have to ask ourselves, where did it come from? It did not come from existing social traditions, but from outside of it. And it came, for example, in Palestine, 1987. Finally, you have Hamas. 40 years after the crisis, right? Then fundamentalism offered itself up as a solution to a problem that no one else was able to resolve. Right? So in a way, for me, and in the rest of the region, you look at other kind of social pressures and social problems and dislocation, what have you, and you can clearly see that what we call fundamentalism was the last option that people had, so to speak, right? And it expressed the radicalism of the opposition to the existing status quo in religious terms, and that worked because religion essentially was the discourse that was freely available to anyone to use. No one had monopoly over it, so to speak. Right? So basically, that became a kind of a resource to be used. If you look at fundamentalism, especially where fundamentalism has become a political force, you see actually similar things. Fundamentalism in the United States and in the West has a different story that actually I can talk about if there's time. But when we look at the region that we're talking about, what we have is basically this kind of Hamas, Muslim Brotherhood, colonialism, basically being kind of the forces that generate kind of what we tend to call kind of fundamentalist response. Now, fundamentalism also is a program that is flexible, even though it does not look like it. And you can see that if you look at the history of movements that we call fundamentalisms, they don't stay with the same program over decades. They change. Sometimes they want to overthrow the state by violent means. Other times they participate in elections. Hamas in 2006, for example, ran for elections like any other political party, right, so to speak, right? And its program included no religion at all, its electoral program at that point. They took that completely out, basically and their electoral campaign back then in 2006, which they won, was entirely focused on combating corruption in the Palestinian Authority. And they were elected because most people perceived them to be actually cleaner, not because they were more religious, but because they were less corrupt than other people. So in a way, I think when we just focus on fundamentalism itself as a frame of thinking, we miss a lot, really, of what fundamentalism, what we call fundamentalism, is doing in society ultimately. These are people, I think, you can talk to, right? They want conversation partners, but they are typically dismissed by people who think of themselves as being more enlightened than the fundamentalist, more educated, better, so to speak, right? And that kind of attitude leads to the marginalization of what we call fundamentalism. They become secluded and they talk only with each other. And that produces, of course, a mindset that is kind of self-enclosed. I can go on, of course, but I think actually fundamentally, so to speak, is it is wrong to really focus on fundamentalism itself as a problem and look at what is it a symptom of? What kind of social problem is that a symptom of?
Yeah, I would strengthen this, and I would say that, I think it's a mistake also to build this dichotomy between fundamentalism and secularism, or to take it for granted that we want necessarily to build a secularist society. I mean, I would certainly, if I have to live under a state, I want to live under a secular state, but not another religious state. But I think we need to acknowledge that religious frameworks and faith frameworks, for better or worse, are a very sort of ingrained part of people's self-perception, especially the working class. I'm talking about both Jews and Palestinians in this respect. And so I think that the idea of sort of needing Israel or Palestine to be a secular Western country has an imprint of a colonial mindset on it. If you look at the Jewish working class, mostly right-wing population, which is more traditional religious, not necessarily fundamentalist or orthodox, This is largely a population coming from, what Muhammad was talking about before, the kind of former Ottoman space. And I think we can definitely also envision modes of multicultural existence and even radical democracy that are not fundamentally opposed to religious practice or tradition, that are moving in ways that move towards more equality, especially gender equality and other aspects. So to me, it's not a question of rejecting religious faith or tradition, but of detaching that from political power, detaching religious organizations from the status of clientism towards the state, in whether towards the state, whether those of the colonizer or of the colonized. And don't even get me started on the degree to which Hamas is a state client of Qatar, a state client of Israel, a state client of Iran, a state client of, there are these institutional connections between nationalist power and religion that need to be severed. But I don't think it's to be taken for granted that secularism and sort of the kind of Western Enlightenment ideal is what we need to strive for. Yeah.
Okay, we'll get started with our first audience question.
First audience question. As a Palestinian in America, anarchism helps describe what I see as historic and traditional forms of Arab self-organization. I wonder if either of the speakers see anarchism when they reflect on Middle Eastern history. Are there any other contemporary anarchist thinkers or movements in Palestine or who are Palestinian?
Okay, I think for me there are really two ways to think about anarchism. There is self-conscious anarchism, right? Which begins its career in the mid-19th century, although the heritage is earlier, goes back to the Enlightenment, but as an organized body of thought and a movement, right? And organizations and intellectuals, critical mass of intellectuals, mid-19th century to the present, right? There's also a larger history of anarchism, which I have called organic anarchism. Other people have different terms for it. Kropotkin has written a lot about it. We see it as kind of embedded in social traditions around the world. And that's the way I regarded it as well. But I also, in my book on anarchism, I included political philosophies from different world traditions, Islamic political philosophy, Hindu world, and so on. So there's a larger kind of history of anarchism, if you want to look at it that way. And there are differences between these two kind of approaches to the idea of voluntary associational life. So the latter one, the organic anarchism, we have plenty of it, but it is always mixed with other kind of approaches to social life as well. So one can say it is contaminated anarchism, although I don't like the term contaminated. But if you have a better term, I'll use it. Mixed, perhaps, but with other ingredients, so to speak, right? And you have to distill it to find kind of the anarchist pure substance, if you want to express it that way. Right? There are Palestinian anarchists as well as Arab anarchists, as well as Iranian anarchists, as well as Turkish anarchists, self-conscious anarchists throughout the whole region, and they come and go. So it is not as though this is actually a massive political movement, so to speak, but it is there. We saw there are people who write about anarchism in Islam. There's a book, for example, right there from an Islamic perspective. So there are kind of people who try to also look at religious traditions, basically in an anarchist kind of way. And I think that can be done as well. If you think of religion, basically at least one variety of religion as one way by which people try to emancipate themselves from other powers, to speak of. So we have that. We have also that in kind of even religious slogans, like the Islamic kind of call, Allahu Akbar, means usually translated as God is great, but actually it is God is greater. This is what it means. Greater than what? Well, it is. You don't need to actually say it, because the implication is that it is greater than any tyranny that you happen to have at any given point in your life, to speak of. So God, which is an idea that is invisible, right? That you do not see, you do not actually kind of have to, does not work like a government, so to speak, unless, of course, a government uses God. Right? That kind of works in the same way as kind of a way to actually give you a sense that there's a force out there in the world against tyranny. There's also, in my work on Islam, the latest book I have on Islam, I have a discussion of just Sharia as historical Sharia as a quasi-anarchist system. And the Sharia, of course, is typically translated as Islamic law, although in fact it has nothing to do with the idea of law as we understand it today. Right? And that is basically, and there are certain properties of the Sharia that can go at length describing the historical Sharia, that is, namely that it has multiple schools, so it's not just one source. It accepts contradictions, that is possible, so modern law does not accept that. And thirdly, it was not promulgated by any government or legislatures to the government, but rather by the scholars of religion and civil society. So in a way, you have kind of a system of living a pious life, right? That did not come out of the state and had multiple sources, and you could pick and choose as you want. That allowed the pious people historically to kind of live a pious life out of moral sources that they themselves had some control over. Of course, that historical Sharia, which I think is anarchist, can become an authoritarian system today when people want to translate it into state law, which has never been the case historically before. Right? So in a way, there are many ways to actually think about a kind of the anarchism as something that is embedded in our historical traditions, as well as the self-conscious kind of anarchist kind of movement that is growing, that is small, but I think it requires kind of more and more kind of internal communication for it to actually be more present on the scene.
Okay, so the individual who spoke earlier at the beginning of the event, I will ask this question now so you have the opportunity to answer it. The question was, is this event from the perspective of Palestinians or from the perspective of anarchists?
Well, the way I see it, there isn't just one Palestinian perspective, and there isn't just one anarchist perspective. Right? There's a variety of perspectives, and I think trying to impose a single perspective on a community is basically rigidifies the reality that we have. Right? So I think of it as from my own Palestinian perspective and my own anarchist perspective. Right? But I make no claim that other Palestinians agree with it, or other anarchists agree with it as well. What makes us interesting as human, I think, is that we have this variety, basically, of standpoints, as opposed to an entire community having just one viewpoint and one stand. Thanks.
Thank you. I'll combine two questions into one, basically. Why is it so prevalent among Israelis to see or believe that that they are actually the victims of a genocide? Why does such a large proportion of the Israeli population and even the Jewish population in the diaspora think that they are the victims of genocide, not the Palestinians? And sort of a corollary to that question is, why is it so difficult for both Israelis and diaspora Jews to see, even if they do not believe that what is happening to Israelis is a genocide, why is it so difficult for them to see that it's just fundamentally wrong on a political or humanitarian level?
I don't know that most Israelis or Jews think that they are currently victims of genocide. I mean, I think there's obviously an overemphasis on the Hamas atrocities and sometimes a tendency to minimize the ethnic cleansing and war crimes in Gaza. I think that's happening because of a sustained effort over the past 20 years plus, what has become essentially a kind of hostile takeover or not so hostile takeover of Jewish public institutions in the diaspora, not just of the Israeli state, by Republican-aligned, if not outrightly fascist forces who have sought to identify the state of Israel with the Jewish people, to place Zionist blinkers on Jews' self-perception, and to paint any and all criticism of the Israeli government as anti-Semitic. The fact that here and there are also indeed, anti-Semitic voices or just kind of black and white, my enemy's enemy stupidity in the Palestinian solidarity movement does not help that, but fundamentally it is the result of a very established by now propaganda line that has been pushed by the Israeli government, by its allies in the American Republican Party, and which has kind of gained traction within public discourse that has to do with identifying criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, and which sort of works by way of constantly inflaming notions of Jewish collective trauma from the Holocaust in ways that are then sort of skewed to apply or to be misapplied to the current situation. So, I mean, there's, and again, I think, there are also situations where I understand that Jews around the world may feel threatened by some of the expressions of outrage at what the Israeli government is doing. But I think that the way in which some Jews have come to feel threatened by any and all opposition to Israeli government practices is the result of a long-standing kind of propaganda effort that's been going on, and it's very heavily entrenched. And there is also a sort of concerted silencing of alternative Jewish and Israeli voices in the mainstream media, which I think feeds into that problem.
Thank you. Can you discuss what you each mean by a no-state solution? What specifically would that look like? How would you explain it to someone with no background in anarchist thought? And can you recommend any works to help us think through the possibility of a no-state solution in Israel, Palestine, and around the world?
Like I said before, I mean, this is a question of what we place as our utopian horizon. What is a no-state solution? I mean, how is there a no state that has borders with other states around it, right? I mean, the no state solution is something that encompasses the Middle East. It's something that encompasses the world. It's as, you know, as liberated and equal and solidaric as you want it to be, you know, no borders, a classless society, and all that good stuff. I mean, but you know, it's not as if we're in a position to now posit some kind of blueprint or some kind of institutional design. And like I said before, it's more a question of what kind of hope we are still able to somehow connect with in this extremely dark time, and how that might reflect on our concrete methods of organizing and doing politics together in the present day.
Okay, just to say something that's about that, in anarchist thought historically, there was an imagination of kind of an ideal world being actually something that consists of a world federation of self-governing communes or small entities, basically. And that goes all the way back to the idea, one of the original ideas of democracy as possible only on small scale, as opposed to in the large states that we have right now. So the idea is there. Of course, the reality is that we have a world map that is governed by states, ultimately. And the state form of political life is the only form that has become familiar to us. And therefore, we imagine emancipation in the form of one state replacing another. But the no-state reality, basically, if we ever have it, is something that kind of transcends the limits of the possible today. And it is something that can be established only by persuasion. Is important, right? That it is the one political program, right, that cannot be done by force. Right? You cannot force a no state on people who want a state, right? So and that goes with anarchy in general. By definition, you cannot impose anarchy on people who do not want anarchy, right? So in a way, and I think that is part of what I think is somewhat the kind of the superiority of anarchy as a perspective, is that only persuasion that is its force, which means that we are talking about an enlightenment project, if you want to call it that. That is ripe in the sense that for transmission, in the sense that the reality we have is now working. Right? The states that we have are generating conflict on an ongoing basis because conflict is the only way by which they can continue to live. Right? And this is something that is becoming more and more obvious, especially today. Right? So in a way, the validity of the no-state solution comes from the experience with the existing states and their continuing failures. And this is something that one has to kind of advocate for. Now, how that actually come into being? It comes into being when there are enough people who are persuaded with the validity of the idea. And then, of course, you have a structure that emerges out of that conviction. Right? So we're talking about a pragmatic process of adjustment to reality, so to speak, that takes time. That is not something that you can actually propose in a theoretical form before actually it has happened, because it requires the agreement of the people who are going to be actually living in that kind of system. Now, I want to say just a couple of words about realism here. Ultimately, the world has typically been changed by people who are unrealistic. Right? That includes Zionism, by the way, because at the beginning of Zionism as a movement, it did not appear to be a realistic proposition at all. But yet, here we are. Right? If you look at many revolutionary movements, if you look at the Bolshevik revolutions or others, they were started by dreamers who had no connection to reality at all, whose revolution did not depend on an accurate analysis of reality. Right? People who were realistic, who thought that within the existing paradigm, that within the structure of power as it is, tended to maintain the structure as it is, because that is what realistic analysis leads you to. You understand the situation as it is, as a structure, meaning that it cannot be changed, because you have understood it to be necessary and inevitable, so to speak. So when I think when we talk about the no-state solution, we're also talking about the perspective that not just rejects existing reality, but also rejects realism as a perspective, so to speak. If you look at the Palestinian resistance movement and its history, also the greatest episodes in the history of Palestinian struggle emerged precisely when conditions were not suitable for it. The general strike in 1936, right? The mobilization in the camps in the late 60s under completely desperate conditions, right? After a defeat. The first Intifada, right, emerged out of conditions where the entire world had forgotten about Palestine and so on, so to speak. Right? So we do have actually movements that are remarkable that we have witnessed in our own lifetime that happened precisely because people rejected realism as a perspective, so to speak, right? And that is actually what we're talking about right now, the inadequacy of the realistic perspective, so to speak, to solve the genocide, right? To solve the kind of problems that we have, right?
Thank you. What can we be doing internationally to organize resistance to war and domination in West Asia?
Each one with their local context. I'm a big believer in think global, act local. I think that any anti-militarist action you take, any action you take against the arms trade is in some knock-on way automatically a Palestine solidarity action, is in some knock-on way automatically a climate action. Okay, is an anti-capitalist action and so on. So, you know, I think that the very immediate sort of, not particularly radical or revolutionary thing that people can do is, put the resources somewhere helpful. And I know that there has been like a slide with a few destinations for donation, right, that has gone with this event, and perhaps we can show that, and maybe the moderators would like to just highlight those afterwards. And wherever we can find a Palestinian-led movement that is seeking out allies, accomplices, call it what you want, that that aligns with how we see things, then that's worth working along with. But I think it's I think it's up to people to look at their very local conditions and to look at who is already organizing on the ground, and do stuff with whatever facet of that is closest to their views and closest to where they can put their energy, in addition to just immediate sort of support for those destinations that are mentioned here in the slide.
I just want to emphasize one thing about what Yuri said, which is the importance of boycotts, right? it is one thing that we can do as individuals without even being a part of any movement. The apartheid system in South Africa collapsed largely because of this global boycott, which kind of was based on the global kind of realization that this is a kind of a racist, unethical system that should not exist in the modern world. So that is an idea that I think needs to be, that is effective. That the Israeli government is very aware of its effectiveness. There's a huge amount of effort it does to quash the boycott movement. Politicians in the US as well as in Europe as being lobbied in order to pass a law to ban boycott, to ban people from actually being able to just not chop against a specific combination. But that shows you exactly that this is a serious movement, and it is non-violent. Actually, you don't have to do anything violent. It is, and you don't have to even leave your house to do it. That you just need to let other people know about it and be persuaded by its effectiveness. That is one thing that is actually kind of direct and easy to do, I think.
Thank you. You mentioned there's more than one school of thought among Palestinians and more than one school of thought in solidarity organizing. One such example we've seen here today is anarchistic. Another example that comes to mind is with the Palestinian youth movement in the US that has been organizing side by side with the Party for Socialism and Liberation, the PSL, or ANSWER, or the People's Forum, who are largely Marxist-Leninist communist groups that have had questionable takes and rhetoric on the struggles of Syrians, of Afghans, of Uyghurs and Ukrainians, and so on, which further demonstrates a lack of mutual internationalist solidarity. With that in mind, what has the global Palestinian solidarity movement done right, and where can it improve?
I think it does not need to kind of insist on the uniformity of viewpoints. That is not something that we require. Palestinian society is diverse, just like any other society. But Palestinians themselves actually suffer from occupation and denial of rights, and that is and their problem is uncomplicated, really. You don't really need to write a philosophy book to actually explain why this kind of oppression is bad. It is self-evidently true. So I think for me, the solidarity movement works best when it uses direct, easy to understand language that highlights the idea of justice as something that is intuitively understandable, right? And that uses whatever kind of language of rights that everyone can understand. Human rights, for example, right to water, sustenance, dignity, citizenship rights, all these things, right? We agree with at the theoretical level. So we are not, and I think actually we shoot ourselves in the foot when we make the story more complicated than it needs to be. It's a simple story.
Speaking of boycotts, what has been the effect of the international BDS movement on the radical left within Israel?
The radical left, in as much as it is still standing, and we're talking about a couple of thousand people. I don't know even what to tell you, in terms of how exactly you qualify that. Has been and continues to be supportive of BDS. I am part of a group that was set up already, I think, within a year of the original PACB call coming out, which is called Boycott from Within. Has of course, overlapping membership with Israelis Against Apartheid and so on. And so, there is support for that within Israel, but again, the Israeli radical left is very small, fighting a retreating battle. Is I mean I think the oppositional movement in Israel is in much better conditions than in Russia, for example, right? And I think certainly for Israeli Jews there is still a space of permitted protest and everything else, but the societies, Jewish Israeli societies, siege mentality, the very ingrained militarism of the society, the sort of perpetuated sense of existential threat that is embedded in public discourse, in media, everything else has meant that at least the emotional reaction to the Israeli radical left is always as to essentially people who support the enemy. And imagine how they might think of you in Alberta, and you'll have a sense of what it might be to be a radical in Israel.
Thank you. Next question. I believe that any solution to the Israel-Palestine problem starts and ends with the U.S. government. Fundamentalist Christians hold a huge amount of sway in the U.S. and strongly support Israel, as well as being anti-Semitic themselves. How do you see dealing with this issue and problem?
Good luck. Yeah, I think they're gonna get the White House soon, and we're in big trouble. So,
if I may just say one thing about this is that it's we cannot rely on the U.S. Although, of course, if the U.S. does the right thing, the problem will be solved, right? But it is not going to do it, right? And no one else is going to do it, by the way, right? Even though everyone knows that if you talk in terms of international relations paradigm, you have a conflict where one party is very strong and the other party is very weak, which means that the stronger party has no incentive to give up anything, right? And the weaker one has no power to actually get the absolute minimum it could be required to resolve the problem. When you have an equation like that, you need a third factor to come in from the outside and impose a solution. That typically would have been the U.S., but Palestine is not a priority for any mainstream U.S. politician. It is not a priority for the Europeans either, and it's not priority even for Arab governments, so to speak. So in a way, this idea of a third factor coming in and imposing a solution, even though technically that would do it, that's not there, right? So the only thing that we have is a resistance movement, right? That actually changes the equation. And that is the only thing that has always worked. Right? Not to change the solution, but to put the problem back on the map. Right? So so every time there was an interest in resolving this conflict, it happened because Palestinians did something dramatic, right? Upset the status quo. Right? And people say, there's a problem there, we have to do something about it. The same thing today, right? That is happening, right? All of no one before October 7th was talking about the two-state solution. Everyone was talking about the Abraham Accords, which means peace between Arab governments and Israel, and forgetting about the Palestinians. That's where we were heading until Hamas, whatever you think of Hamas, by the way, right, whatever it did, at least it put Palestine back on the map, right? And then all of a sudden, Biden is talking about the two-state solution, right? In a completely insincere way, I believe, right? Because ultimately he is not doing anything, right, to actually make it happen, right? And you can tell that European governments likewise either do not have, like Germany, are not interested in this issue either, and they're happy with the status quo as it is, even though they claim otherwise. But that's pure hypocrisy, ultimately. And other European powers who are generally interested do not have actually any influence on the situation. So the only thing that you have right now, basically, is the only thing that has historically worked out, which is that the people who are oppressed take matters into their own hand, right? And continue to struggle or do resistance in a way that catches international attention, so to speak, and put themselves back on the map. This is not the first time this has happened in Palestinian history, but this is a repeated pattern, right? Where you yourself, basically, right, as the subject, right, of oppression, become an agent, right, in the struggle as opposed to be an object of it. Right?
Sure. What do you think would be the strongest or most effective force or method to counteract the strong penchant among Israeli Jews to dehumanize non-Jews and especially to dehumanize Palestinians?
The fish stinks from the head. The problem is the mainstreaming of theological supremacist and racist discourse by the Israeli leadership, the level of kowtowing to the far right that we have seen, not just by Netanyahu, but also by the kind of what is now shown as the centrist alternative. So I don't think people are born to dehumanize, right? People dehumanize because A, it comes at no cost, and B, because they are given frameworks of thinking that encourage them to do that. And so, I think we should think about it the same way as maybe a lot of the American mainstream public was dehumanizing Afghans and Iraqis earlier this century. To me, like dehumanizing mentalities is a sort of discursive symptom of actual power imbalances. It's a mechanism for people to self-legitimate, to give themselves some kind of way of reconciling their attempt to their desired self-image as good people with the fact that atrocities are being committed in their name, and the way to reconcile that is to portray the victims of those atrocities as uniformly threatening, menacing, dangerous enemies who are, forever ill-disposed to agreement and motivated by hatred and by anti-Semitism and the rest of it, which can become a self-fulfilling prophecy, of course. I mean, we saw how support for Hamas skyrocketed in Palestinian polls precisely because of that sort of element of agency that Muhammad was talking about. Whereas, this is a situation that has been created by the refusal of the Israeli side to move anywhere, really, for 15, 20 years and more. So I don't think dehumanization is, as a discursive issue, can be solved at that level. I think it's symptomatic of the very kind of material power relations that exist, and in order to envision a different discourse, we need to envision a different leadership. We need to envision a different sort of prevalent ideology. And I don't know if Israel and Palestine is going to have something like it, a South African moment. I mean, who knows? That would be a very sort of positive thing to happen. and something that nobody really could foresee, a year or two before the collapse of apartheid. So the fact that the collapse of apartheid or the collapse of the Soviet Union were things that happened without any kind of major expectation for it to happen, that still gives me hope. But it's a very, very thin sliver.
Just briefly, I agree with Yuri mostly. I just say for change of public opinion to happen, you need two things, or one of two things. First of all, a process of persuasion. We can talk about what this means in terms of how people talk about security and all that. Rationalization. But more importantly, I think, and more effectively, is to reveal that the situation that we have is very costly, that the occupation is not free of cost, so to speak. And that is something that I think should happen on an ongoing basis. The fact that the Palestinian cause was on its way to be completely forgotten before October 7th had to do with the perception in Israel and outside of Israel, among other governments, that it doesn't matter because actually this occupation is not costing anybody anything, to speak of. That, of course, has changed right now. I don't mean that this is the only way. What happens is October 7th is the only way to change the kind of the question of cost. But basically, any other way of changing, of kind of increasing the cost of the occupation, including boycotts, for example, that can also have the same effect.
What are some good resources for what Mohammed was saying about fundamentalism and secularism?
There is a lot of literature on that right now. If I may, I would recommend my own book. I can send you a copy if you want to. Life Worlds of Islam, 2019, where I do actually go deeply into kind of the origins, basically, of this movement and how it should be read and what could we learn from that kind of analysis. Sorry about this self-promotion, but it is based on works that other people have done prior.
Well, for me, it's also not quite self-promotion, but I did support Muhammad Abdu in producing the book Anarcho-Islam, which you mentioned before, and I think is even present there. So that's out from Pluto Press, and has a lot of quite fine-grained discussion of the possibilities of Islamic anarcha-istijhad, what he calls this kind of anarchistic grappling with the sources.
Our last question is for Yuri. Does the painting behind your head represent this conflict?
God, no. Yeah, I mean, I know that it says coexist and shit. This is a poster that I picked up maybe 20 years ago at a museum on the Seam, which is a Jewish Arab kind of shared gallery that used to exist on the border between East and West Jerusalem. It's actually a portrait by a German artist. And no. First of all, because I don't believe in coexistence. I believe at this point is in joint struggle, and in a shared fate of Jews and Palestinians on the ground and anywhere else. And I don't believe in sort of erasing any asymmetries that exist. So maybe, it's the first time I've actually been asked about this. So yeah, I mean, it doesn't really. it's something that, it's something that my ex picked up and kind of stayed in the house and stuff. But no, it's not, I wouldn't go too far with that.
Great. Well, that's all the time for questions we have. Thank you, gentlemen. So thank you, Yuri. Thank you, Mohammed, for taking the time to speak with us today. Thank you to the audience for having a wonderful and very civil conversation. Please check out our books. Thank our sponsors, Camus, Anarchist Archive, UVic, Sunset Lab, Anarchist Network of Vancouver Island. Come to Camus Info Shop and get educated on many of these issues. We are at Quadra, just south of Hillside. We are open 10 to 6 every day of the week. And finally, to I think Yuri and Mohammed's point about how we can help most directly, on everybody's chair is a flyer for how to engage in direct action and help the people of Palestine. So please do what you can. And thank you very much for a wonderful afternoon.